Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show.
Without education, it's difficult to plan, it's difficult to understand what's going on around the world.
Football legend Didier Drogba is just the latest in a long list of big names to back the Global Partnership for Education's Raise Your Hand financing campaign. The programme, which seeks to put to an end the world's learning crisis, will conclude in London later this month. Alice Albright, GPE's Chief Executive Officer, will be joining me from Washington, D.C. to provide some insight into the $5 billion endeavour. And the devastating fallout continues in the Democratic Republic of Congo following the recent eruption of the Mount Nyiragongo volcano. The city of Goma is estimated to have a population of close to 1 million people, with about half of that number at risk of being displaced. Activist and writer Vava Tampa will be providing an update on the rapidly emerging humanitarian crisis. And later, I'll be running through the biggest company news stories of the week. But first, let's start the show with business news from here in the UK, where according to the mortgage lender Nationwide Building Society, house prices have risen by their fastest annual rate in 7 years, driven by a demand for bigger homes outside the city and a temporary break of the housing tax. Last month, the price of the average UK home was a record £243,000, up £24,000 over the past 12 months. An acceleration of 10.9%. The rise surpassed forecasts by economists and sparked robust debate about whether the boom would be followed by a bust. In other British business news, the government's hopes of scrapping the final social restrictions imposed on the public appear to be fading fast as the Indian variant of the disease continues to drive up infections. As it stands, Prime Minister Boris Johnson's roadmap ends on the 21st of June, but the rise in cases has caused concern among the country's health experts. This is despite the country recording 0 deaths for the first time in 447 days earlier this week. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, it feels like we've been here before. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, seems super keen that we are heading towards a June 21st easing of restrictions. But Nicola Sturgeon may have put the spanner in the works, hasn't she?
Yeah, well, this is the big date that everyone's been looking forward to when it was first announced that we were going to have these various lifting of restrictions at different dates. Everyone was talking about the 21st of June and what are you going to do on the 21st of June? And I think most people probably thought that it's unlikely that these lifting of restrictions were going to go ahead as smoothly as they have done. And now the data does seem to suggest that in parts of the country at least, coronavirus cases are creeping up, and with various variants going around, it's becoming more transmissible in certain areas, and across the board certainly it's sort of slowed down the number of people not getting it. So I think there is the real worries there about whether we're opening up too early on June the 21st. Having said that, 75% of people now have had their first dose across the UK. Obviously the vaccination programme's going well. But yes, as you say, Boris says he doesn't see anything in the statistics to say that they shouldn't open on the 21st of June. His other ministers are being a little bit more cautious, saying, well, you have to wait and see. The vaccines minister saying we haven't made any firm decision yet. And I think a lot of people are probably a little bit worried that we're going a little bit too soon, given we have done that pretty much twice already before and then had to row back on it a couple of weeks later and things have gone badly as a result. So we know that Boris is quite positive in his outlook. He wants to open up the world again. And actually fair enough, because a lot of hospitality leaders have said this will be the death knell for smaller businesses, little hotels, boutique hotels that really rely on people to start moving again and staying in hotels again. And I think quite a few other businesses will think the same way. But if you look at various cities like Glasgow, you pointed to Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland saying, we can't go ahead with what we planned. I think a lot of people in the UK government will say, actually, that is a good course of action, because if you look in various hotspots towards the north of the country, where there are a lot of people who may have brought in this Indian variant, then they have a point there that maybe we should slow down a little bit. But it's not nationwide. It is sort of in specific places. But I don't think it's a bad idea to push it back a couple of weeks, which is what more and more scientists seem to be saying. But we know the UK government, or this current UK government, and Boris in particular, very positive in terms of trying to make the best of everything, and he probably does want to push ahead. So it remains to be seen, and yeah, we'll probably be here next week talking about pretty much the same thing, but it is a big deal for the country, it is a big deal for businesses, and for people's mental health. People obviously still not seeing their friends or worried to go indoors and see people they haven't seen for a while. So yeah, there's a lot of different factors going on here, but I guess everyone will be watching that variant, the rate of transmission and how many people are catching it before that decision is made about June the 21st.
Thank you, Simon. At the end of this month, Prime Minister Boris Johnson will host Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta at the Global Education Summit in London. The gathering will showcase Global Partnership for Education's once-in-a-generation fundraising programme, Raise Your Hand, which is seeking to invest $5 billion to transform education in lower-income countries. The project has recently had the backing of twice African Player of the Year in Chelsea football legend Didier Drogba.
Well, I believe the role that education can play in Côte d'Ivoire and in Africa in general is to contribute to, again, stability in some countries, in every country, because the less your people are educated, the easiest is it to send the wrong message, to fool them, to bring a country into war. You know, that's why I believe that education is important for stability, for example. And also, it is important, like I say, and if you have stability, then you can talk about development.
Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by the CEO of GPE, Alice Albright. Alice previously served in President Obama's administration as the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. She joins me now from Washington, D.C. Alice Albright, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Of course, during the pandemic, during the ebbs and flows, we've been discussing extensively children who appear to have been the hidden victims of COVID-19. GPE said they're committed to ending the world's learning crisis. Can you describe what this learning crisis looks like?
Yes, and Juliana, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join your show. We've been very much looking forward to this, and I want to congratulate you on all the great work that you're doing. Indeed, the pandemic has represented the most unprecedented and profound challenge for education globally that we've seen really in the modern age. And that challenge has taken many forms in many places. In many of the developed countries, there remains a question of a transition to a more digital environment for learning. But in the developing countries with whom my organization works very closely, it is a far more profound challenge. We've seen that education has been disrupted despite some very important efforts to try to go digital in some places. Remote learning has been very difficult because of various infrastructure challenges. And so the pandemic has had a very inequitable effect across the globe. And children that live in the developing nations are going to have a real struggle getting back to school. Learning will be lost. Of course, these challenges will be most profoundly affected by some of the most marginalized parts of countries, and that tends to be girls. So we are really worried about children getting back to school, recovering learning, and particular girls getting back into the classroom.
Absolutely. We've shown our viewers a bit of footage of the Raise Your Hand campaign. I'm sure everybody would have recognised Didier Drogba, pretty popular on the continent. I know it's been ongoing for several months, this campaign. What are some of the lasting changes you're hoping this renewed awareness about education inequalities will bring?
So the goal of our campaign is really twofold. One is to raise awareness about the education challenge and get it to the very, very top of the agenda. And we'll start with that with the G7 in a couple of weeks, and it will go on from there. And the point there is that we cannot have the future that we want without better education for all of the world's children. And that's going to be particularly hard to reach for children in the developing nations. When you click down a level, what we're really aiming for is better quality of education, better learning opportunities, a recovery from the pandemic, and getting all the children back into the classroom that have either not been able to come because of the pandemic or before that, given some of the circumstances before that. We also have significant financial goals for the campaign. We decided when we started the planning of it that we had to really dig down deep and be as ambitious as we possibly can with our goals. In terms of the international donors, most of whom are sovereign donors and foundations, we're looking to raise at least $5 billion to cover our work for the next 5 years. And the overall point of that will be around transforming how education is delivered, in part to recover from the pandemic. We're also putting a big spotlight on what we call domestic financing, which is the extent to which countries are able to put their own domestic resources into education. That covers a significant part of the operating expenses of education, such as teacher payroll. And one of the things that we'll be seeking are commitments from country partners to protect their investments in education financing, so that we have both the domestic piece and the international piece coming together and enabling us to really improve how education is delivered over the coming years.
Absolutely. You spoke about the G7. Finally, virtual diplomacy is going to be actual. We hope so. I know one of, probably not a sideline, but I know Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta will be meeting Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the Global Education Summit. What should we expect from that?
Well, let me just back up for a second and tell you a little bit about how we've structured all of this. We are a true partnership between the Global North and the Global South. When we do our replenishment campaigns, we invite a G7 leader and a prominent head of state from one of our country partners to go at it together. And that's, they are together working on leading this campaign. I expect that both of them will talk about how important it is for all of our partners to commit. And they'll be talking about getting donors involved, getting countries involved, getting foundations involved, and I expect some strong outcomes there. We are looking for significant pledges of funding from our donors. We expect that of the $5 billion, that about 70% of it will come from the G7, about 20% of it from the Nordic countries, and then the remainder from other key parts of the world with whom we work, the Middle East, Australia, Japan, Korea. Well, Japan's part of the G7. And a number of other places, other parts of Europe that are not part of the G7. And what President Kenyatta and Prime Minister Johnson will be doing will be coming together and say, you know, look, we've got to make progress on this topic. We are not going to have the future that we want unless we fund it properly. You got to put your money where the issues are, and education is one of those places.
Absolutely. As part of GPE's mission statement, you describe a resilient, inclusive education system. What is that? What does that look like?
So we've just lived through perhaps the best example of that, which is the pandemic. And, about, a little over a year ago, the only policy tool that governments had to stop the spread of coronavirus was to shut everything down. And so virtually overnight, schools everywhere were closed. And what that showed to us was really two things. One is not only how vulnerable education is, it can be shut down like this for a pandemic or a war or a flood or an earthquake, but also how valuable it is and how irreplaceable it is. And you can't just expect children to continue learning without being able to go to school and have access to teachers. So when so what is the vision? The vision is school systems that are open, that have trained teachers, enough for every student, that are equitably available. So this is not just education for the more well-to-do families. This is education for everybody. So we're talking about girls, children with disabilities, children who live in faraway places. And we're talking about staying in school and learning the skills that are necessary to be prepared for the 21st century, to have children that are ready to go for the world that is ahead of us, which is going to be a world that will have more pandemics. It will have climate change to deal with. It will have more insecurity. It will have a very changing type of job and employment market. So the vision is school, quality learning for everybody to be ready for the future.
Well, absolutely. I know Alice Albright, Channels Business Global, looking forward to following you on this journey. And of course, we'll make sure we cover the Education Summit when it takes place in July. Alice Albright, Chief Executive Officer of GBE, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business.
Thank you, Juliana, and appreciate all your attention to this very, very important issue. And I hope we see you in London at the end of July. So thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be discussing the Democratic Republic of Congo's latest humanitarian crisis with activist and writer Vava Tampa. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a few minutes, I'll be speaking to the activist and writer Vava Tampa about the humanitarian fallout in the Democratic Republic of Congo following last weekend's terrifying Mount Nyiragongo volcano eruption. But before then, here's some company news for you. According to a tweet posted by Elon Musk, the price of Tesla vehicles are increasing due to supply chain pressures across the auto industry. Last month, the electric vehicle maker boosted prices on its Model 3 and Model Y cars for the fifth time. The sector has been hit hard by a notable shortage of raw materials and computer chips due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Musk's tweet was in response to a user who expressed displeasure at how Tesla was increasing the prices of its vehicles while also removing the features of some cars, including the lumbar support for the seats in the Model Y. Transport for London has secured another short-term funding agreement worth £1.08 billion from the British government to keep the capital's public transport services running. The current deal comes on top of the £1.6 billion it received in May 2020, £1.8 billion in November, and a £500 million support package received in March. London Mayor Sadiq Khan and transport union bosses have slammed the deal as it comes with several conditions which include a wage freeze, pension reforms, rising fares, as well as other cost-cutting measures. Amazon has announced its annual Prime Day event will take place on the 21st and 22nd of June. The Bargain Bonanza is arguably the world's biggest shopping event of the year, known for hugely competitive deals on big-ticket items from sought-after brands. Many of the best offers come in the form of tech, home appliances, gaming and fashion. Despite disruption due to the pandemic, last year's sales hit $10.4 billion, up 45.2% from 2019. Experts anticipate this year's event will be bigger than ever due to pent-up consumer demand and the surge in online shopping. The devastating fallout continues in the Democratic Republic of Congo following the eruption of the Mount Nyiragongo volcano. The city of Goma is estimated to have a population of close to 1 million people, with about half of that number at risk of being displaced. This is the latest in a series of devastating crises that have the potential to push the fragile nation over the edge. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by writer and activist Vava Tampa. Vava Tampa, it's always a pleasure to have you on Channel's Business Global. I was just saying to you off camera there that it's a shame that every time we have these discussions, they tend to be quite dark. UNICEF is reporting that almost 400,000 people are facing the risk of severe hunger and disease. Can you just provide us with an update on what you believe is happening on the ground right now?
Well, yes, the actual figure for the entire country is actually 27 million people in Congo are facing starvation. And that is not because of a natural disaster. These are man-made catastrophe. And when I say man-made, what I mean is it's the decisions of people. See, Congo has been experiencing conflict or crisis or wars and invasions for the last 20 years. And when there is war, when there is violence, when there is invasions, it kills people, but also displaces people. In displacing people, it destroys people's ability to do farming and for food to come into the market and so on and so forth. As a result of all of these situations, farms being destroyed, people being displaced, we find ourselves in a country of 100 million people with 27 million Congolese facing starvation, 1 in 4. And yet Congo has incredibly huge number of land able to feed the entire African continent. But yet, because of violence, because of impunity, we cannot feed our own population. 27 million are now facing starvation.
Absolutely. There are a multitude of different conflicts, as you said, the majority of them being man-made. What's exactly happening in the city of Goma? We know that's where the volcano is erupted. So many kind of varying reports. We had the massive eruption last weekend. I've read that there have been earthquakes and tremors subsequent to that. What's happening on the ground there? Are we getting the aid agencies in? Are these people being fed and clothed and housed?
So the eruption happened, as you mentioned, on Saturday, the 22nd. Since that Saturday, we have experienced over 250 earthquakes and tremors. As a result, the government asked 10 of the 18 boroughs that makes up Goma to essentially evacuate. That is approximately 1 million people being displaced. But those people being displaced without any food, without any drinking water, without any sanitation, without any security. So essentially, it became our issue as the people to organize ourselves, to congregate and to unite and build together to see how we can feed our people on the ground. And Congolese people on the ground have been doing amazing work in places such as Saki, Rutshuru, and Goma. You have young Congolese essentially feeding people have been displaced, and now we are beginning to see international community send aid in the form of the World Food Program, going to distribute some help and so on and so forth. But the biggest problem now we face, now that over 1 million people are returning to their homes, because scientists have said that the eruptions or the volcano no longer pose an imminent threat to the people's lives. Now we are facing a massive issues of how are those people going to rebuild? The government hasn't yet put together a plan on how those people are going to rebuild their lives.
We spoke last time, Vava, about aid agencies, and we know that, you know, for those of us who are familiar with them, they can be quite polarising. Of course, on the surface, they are there, they're helping, but of course, you know, there are so many ripple effects from them being on the ground. The Norwegian Refugee Council has described the multitude of conflicts in the DRC as the world's most neglected crisis. I presume I already know your answer, but I'll ask anyway. Is this a fair assessment?
It is. I mean, look, when we talk about DRC, we need to remember this is a country which the United Nations has described as the rape capital of the world because of the ways in which warlords and militias in the Congolese army, but also in the Rwandan army, in the Ugandan army, have used rape as a way of destroying community, of displacing community, of punishing community, of humiliating community. We are talking about 6 million people killed in the first 10 years of this crisis. We are talking about 27 million people facing starvation. We are talking about 6.5 million Congolese being internally displaced and 1 million being displaced because of the volcano. So when you find yourself facing all this crisis, yet the world is fascinatingly quiet, no one speaks of these issues. And crucially, and this is the crucial element, Juliana, no one responsible for these crimes has yet faced justice.
Clearly, Vava, the Congolese population is impatient for change, and I know that change is being led by the diaspora, not just the Congolese diaspora, but the diaspora across the world. How does the DRC chart a strategic way forward? And we're talking about strategy here. We're not talking about, you know, the conflict between the diaspora and the government. What is the strategy forward? It cannot continue like this. Not when the DRC is sitting on the world's minerals. The DRC should be the most wealthiest country in the world, and it's not. How do we get that?
You are absolutely right. Absolutely right. Look, Juliana, peace begins with justice. Okay, without justice, there can never be peace, and we know this from personal experience. The international community has done everything but justice in attempting to assist Congo to emerge. So the international community sent the largest UN peacekeeping mission in the world, yet the killings continue. Only yesterday, Juliana, 51 people were killed by machete. There is no coverage whatsoever of this crisis. Okay, so we know that unless impunity, the impunity which is fueling the violence, which is fueling the crisis which is consuming Congo, unless that impunity is put to an end, nothing is going to change.
Well, I think that's a great way to end the interview, and a great way To end the show, Vavat Hamper, activist and writer. Thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.